Hi, Sai, Karate Illuminati, this is Noah, and today I wanted to go over my Makiwara a little bit because I've been getting a lot of questions on how it's built, and that's something I've gotten questions on before, so I wanted to address that a little bit here today. So, to give you an overview of the way that the Makiwara post itself is built, it is 3 different pieces of wood. On mine, you can take one thicker piece of wood and cut it so that it tapers, so that it's thicker at the bottom and thinner at the top, and you'll get a similar effect out of that. Important things to note when you're looking at building a Makiwara would be the flexibility in the post, and that's what that taper or these multiple layers are for. If you hit a Makiwara, or push a Makiwara even, it should be able to flex pretty far. You know, I've seen and hit some Makiwara that do not move. You hit them and they just sort of shake a little bit. They don't really have any flex to them. You want a Makiwara to actually have a significant amount of flex to some degree, several inches of it anyway, so that when you hit it, it moves. It doesn't just stay in one place. And the reason for that is really twofold. One, you need something to absorb the shock of you hitting something. If you hit a solid object, your body is really taking the brunt of that impact, not the solid object. If you're hitting something that moves, you can actually transfer that force into the target, not just have it bounce back into you, so to speak. And that's better for your joints and your body over time. But really the big part of that is the fact that it provides you progressive resistance and immediate biomechanical feedback. So when you hit the Makiwara and you're driving into it, it's driving back at you. So that's something that if you were trying to, say, check your punch and see how well you're doing with your form, it gives you an actual practical tool to measure how effective that is structurally. And what I mean by that is this: if I hit the Makiwara and it pushes back at me and my wrist isn't properly aligned or isn't strong enough for the amount of power that I'm putting behind it, it can buckle now because it's being pushed back against. Same thing applies to other joints as well. If my tricep isn't engaged enough, my elbow can actually buckle if I'm getting that feedback from the Makiwara. My shoulder can roll up. If my core is not engaged properly, I can get pushed backward. And even all the way down to my feet. Let's say my core was engaged tightly enough and I don't get pushed backward up here, but if I hit this hard enough and my stance isn't good enough, I might actually get rocked back on my heels. And so these are really important things that you really can't get a good feel for hitting a target that swings away from you. So if you get a heavy enough heavy bag that you can just really lay into it, or you get somebody who can hold it, you can get some of that same feedback to a degree, but you don't get the progressive resistance. So it's, in a way, a safer thing to hit, but I think that for purposes of really building the strength in your punch, a Makiwara is a really good tool for that. And so not only does it help you figure out where your form might be lacking or where you're not strong enough, but by its very nature, it is a resistance training method for that strike. So the more you work it, the stronger it will get. And you can still do other supplemental training to strengthen whatever muscles or joints are lacking, but the Makiwara is a good way to check it and strengthen it at the same time. So with that kind of general overview taken care of, let's take a look at how the Makiwara is built on a little bit more detailed level. Starting with the post, as I mentioned, it is a 3-piece construction post. So if we take a look at it a little bit closer, the boards that I used are red oak, and they are 1x4s, but those are lumber inches, so it's not actually 4 inches by 1 inch. The width is probably about 3.5 to 3 1/4, and then the thickness is probably about 3/4 of an inch. And I have 3 of them, and the reason that I prefer this over the cut tapered method is because you can adjust it. So if you look at it, and I've got things in the way here, but this is where the top of the second board is, and you see that it is shorter than the height of the tallest board, the front board here. So this starts to add some resistance. And then as we continue down, we come to the third board, which is cut even shorter. And I have them tied in place with rope, but you can glue them together and essentially make a laminate. And what that is basically making is a leaf spring. And that's how you get that progressive resistance and biomechanical feedback that I was discussing. If it's a solid post with no flex, you're not going to get that. So you do need something that flexes. And because this is a 3-board construction, if it is too stiff, let's say this board is too high, or that bottom board is too high, if it's too stiff, and it's providing too much resistance to you, you just trim them down. And I have actually had to trim both of these boards down from what they were when I originally built it, because when I first built it, and I attached it to a base and I tested it, it was too stiff. So I cut those boards down and reduced some of that pushback. You can, of course, increase it then by increasing the height of the supporting boards. You can actually even take the bottom one out entirely if you want a lot of flex for things like your small surface strikes that you want it to move a lot more because you just can't put as much force into. When we move down to the base, this is where people always have questions. You can buy bases like this, but they are kind of a niche item, so they can be a little expensive. Now, this is one that I made with a friend who is a welder and metalworker by trade. So he and I were able to work on this and put it together fairly cheaply. So if you have a friend who likes to weld and can weld, that would be an option for you. The way that it essentially works in this is we set it to a slight angle. If you look at it, the boards are tilted so that they are leaning slightly toward the striker. And that is preferable because as a strike comes in to hit it, it gives you a little more travel distance before the lower part of the pad starts to touch your fingers. So when you're hitting it, you get to push it a ways before you take out that space. That is preference though. You can have it be straight up and down. The rest of this arrangement is obviously 4 bolts down to the platform. You could bolt that down to your concrete floor if you had the right tools for it, but I prefer the platform because it is easier to move around and store. The 2 bolts through all 3 boards was the way I went with clamping everything together. You can, instead of doing that, have bolts that go on the outsides of the boards and essentially squeeze it all together like a vise. That is an option as well. And there are some other interesting arrangements that you can find online. An improvised version of this is something I shared in an article that my friend Ryan Parker Sensei had made some years ago, where you can use shelving brackets to make something similar. And you can do that too with some of the reinforcing steel strapping that you can get for work on construction. So you'll find those in the lumber sections, usually of hardware stores. The platform itself is nothing fancy on mine. I literally bought a single sheet of 3/4 inch thick plywood, which is 4 feet wide by 8 feet long, and I had them cut it in half, so I had 2 4-foot squares. I stacked them on top of each other and I screwed them together. So nothing terribly fancy about that. I do tend to use wood glue in the middle so that it stays together, because I don't like putting screws in the middle of it. I prefer to keep them around the outside. And then of course, if you're going to use this with bare feet, you'll want to spend a lot of time sanding it. I have at this point only really sanded the outside edges because they can be very jagged from the saw cuts and things like that. But if you're going to use them bare feet, I do recommend spending a good amount of time sanding them. If we move to the pads, there are several, and while we're talking about the pads, I'm going to talk a little bit about the height of the Makiwara. My Makiwara is a Shuri Makiwara, which means that it comes up to about my sternum, as opposed to a Naha Makiwara, which really only comes up to about solar plexus level. And there are some that you can find examples of that come up to chin height as well. So this is something that I can't give you a measurement for because you have to base it on yourself. Now, Ryan Parker, in his article, does mention that the benefit of making one that is taller, so say this would be about my chin height over the top of it here. If I made it this tall, then I could, instead of having a pad that has a loop over the top so that it stops it from sliding, you could just slide the pad up and down wherever you wanted it. So that is something that you can consider for how adjustable you want it to be. As he mentioned there as well, the Naha one is a little bit easier for people to get started with because it does promote keeping the shoulder down and locking the lats because it is a lower target. But you can, as I mentioned, just move the target as well. The pad that I have on here is one that I made. It's pretty straightforward, leather with holes punched in it. Now, the only kind of unique thing is that I folded over the bottom here so that it's open on the inside, and it essentially makes a little pocket. And the reason that I did that is tucked down here, I have a little piece of flooring mat foam that I cut that will fit in to that little pocket and give me some extra padding. And the reason for that is when you are working on the Makiwara, a lot of the time you will eventually make your knuckles too sore to really be able to continue hitting. And if you get too sore, you have to stop training for a while. You don't want to do that. So before you reach that point, add the pad so that you can train longer without reaching that point. Now, the rope pad underneath, the more traditional rope pad, is one that a lot of people like to do. But I do see a lot of people, instead of doing it the way that it was traditionally done, they actually just wrap the boards in rope, kind of like this, the way that I've done it for reinforcement. That does not really add any padding for you, and personally I find it to be a little dangerous because when you're hitting it, your knuckles can slide into these little gaps, and you can scrape them up real bad, and you can bang them up pretty good. So not my preference. The way that these were done, this is closer to original methods, but not quite, because they used actual rice straw, and I don't have that. But I took manila rope from the hardware store and looped it several times this way. And you can see the tops of the loops, bottoms of the loops, and you just make a big bundle of it that way, and then wrap around the outside as tight as you can. Now when you do that, you'll have a round bundle, and then you have to pound it flat. And once you've done that, you can tie it to your post, and that gives you something that is not only a little bit more forgiving to hit than the leather pad, as far as impact goes, it toughens the skin a little bit more, which some people are into. Something that I mentioned earlier was that it's meant for, training your structure and developing power and testing and giving feedback to your punch, which it is. Those are its primary functions. It does also toughen the hands, but that is not really its intended purpose, or at least not the purpose that fits with the way that it's created. So while you can do that, I prefer to have these as options if you want to work on some conditioning while you're working your technique and your power development. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of how you might be able to build one of these yourself the way that I have done it. Now, if you cannot either make, buy, or build in some way that mounting bracket at the bottom, you can make one of these that can mount to a wall, or you can make one that actually sinks in the ground, which is the original way they were made. When you do the ones sunk in the ground, the thing that you need to make sure you do is put boards that go this way in front and behind the Makiwara in the ground. Generally, you want the one that's in front to be toward the top, and then the one that's on the back to be at the very bottom of the hole. And that just gives it some extra stability in the ground. and you do need to treat the wood that's in the ground with some heavy-duty waterproofing agent. I think traditionally they used pitch, which may or may not be easy for you to get, but that would definitely help preserve it in the ground, just because there's a lot of stuff in the ground that is going to eat away at that wood. The wall-mounted ones I have only made one of, but you essentially just start stacking boards at the bottom to give it some space away from the wall, and then bolt it in. I've seen people kind of make cross-braced mounting fixtures with wood that'll screw into different studs and things like that. So that's things that you can sort of play with, but that should at least still support something like this that has that flex to it.